And you saw what happened to the opener today. If you caught any of the Pirate game, did not go well for him today. So I'll try to do well as the closer here. So my paper is titled Education, Diglossia, and Social Context Expectations in the New Testament. This is an essay that I wrote and submitted for publication that's going to be coming out in a publication titled New Testament and Sociolinguistics, something like that, by Brill. So I'll just jump right in. Hopefully we'll leave some time at the end for some questions. Each evening, I call my octogenarian father to check in on him. My wife often chuckles when she listens in on my end of the telephone conversation. Why is that? Well, my father was a blue-collar high school graduate who grew up and spent almost all of his life in Western Pennsylvania, and this is the context in which I grew up as well. My father is what is affectionately called in these parts a Yinzer. Yinzers have a very distinct accent that involves in part substituting the OU and the OW diphthong, as in the words south or down with an ah sound. For Yinzers, the words south side becomes south side. The word downtown becomes downtown. And even the days of the week have a distinct Yinzer pronunciation. Sunday becomes Sunday, Monday becomes Monday, etc. What causes my wife to giggle is that when I call my father, I automatically code switch from my fairly nondescript mid-Atlantic accent to the Yinzer accent with which I grew up. Now, I should say that for detailed research, a lot of research done on this, particularly by Barbara Johnstone, who has published 2 essays on that, 2011, 2008, 2006. What is fascinating about the conversational dynamic between my father and me is that much has happened in my life to influence the way that I now ordinarily speak in context other than with my father. I'm now a middle-aged man with 2 master's degrees and a PhD whose educational training required me to live in places like Boston, and Princeton, New Jersey, and Chicago. My educational experience, as well as my experience living in other areas of the country, has moderated the Yinzer accent of my youth. My wife has observed that when I attend a scholarly conference, or when I lecture in the classroom, or even when I preach, I do so with my Yinzer accent mostly hidden, and instead manifest a very generic form of Mid-Atlantic accent. However, what makes her giggle is that each evening when I make that telephone call to my father, the Yinzer accent emerges strongly. I've learned to move back and forth between that accent with my father back to a more generic Mid-Atlantic accent that my wife and I use in the home. For the purposes of this paper, the field of sociolinguistics recognizes at least 2 major concepts at work in the phenomenon described above. First, a person's level of education expands that person's options for code switching in any given speech act opportunity. In the illustration above, this writer's level of education has permitted a seamless movement from a familial Yinzer social context to the more sophisticated social context where scholarly papers are presented. Second, the social context for a certain occasion of speech and the expectations that both parties have for that occasion will be decisive in the kind of language that's employed. In the illustration above, the reciprocal expectations on the part of this writer and this writer's father guide the employment of the Yinzer dialect. Likewise, the reciprocal expectation of this writer and an audience at a scholarly conference guide the employment of a more formal form of English when a scholarly paper is read. Of course, other factors play a part in the phenomenon discussed above, such as geography and social mobility factors. But for the purpose of this paper, we will limit our expectations to these 2 concepts. The purpose of this paper is to explore how the phenomenon discussed above might have affected the language choices of the New Testament writers. There are really 2 questions under consideration here. First, did the educational level or lack of formal education of the New Testament authors influence their written communication? And did the social context expectation of both of the New Testament writer and his original audience play a role in the form of Greek utilized in that canonical document. Whether we are dealing with oral or written communication, social context is a determining factor when it comes to language choices. As Romaine's introductory textbook on sociolinguistics suggests, quote, "The first step in understanding what choices are available to speakers is to gain what idea of what languages and varieties are available to them in a particular social context." In multilingual contexts like that of the 1st century AD Roman Empire, the social context was quite complex. In 1st century Palestine, for example, recent studies like that of Ong have shown that most Jewish residents were at least bilingual with a degree of fluency in both Aramaic and Greek, and some residents were even able to navigate in Hebrew, the language of Jewish religion. There was also some residents able to navigate to a limited degree in Latin, the political civil magistrate language of their Roman overlords. The complex social context of 1st century Palestine makes the question concerning the language that Jesus and his disciples spoke themselves complex as well. In the 1st century AD, Greek remained the common language used particularly throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, given its dominance established several centuries earlier as a result of Alexander the Great's successful military campaigns and subsequent program of Hellenization. However, as dominant as Greek was in the Eastern Empire, the form of Greek spoken and written in various regions of the Eastern Empire differed, influenced by a variety of factors. One of those factors was education. Formal education promoted a standardization of spoken and written Greek, while lack of formal education resulted in a less standardized form that differed region to region. In sociolinguistic terms, what resulted from education in standardized Greek is what sociolinguists often refer to as a high form of the language, and those without the experience of formal education in High Greek were left to speak and write in Low Greek. The distinction between high and low forms of language is often referred to as diglossia by sociolinguistics. Now, there is a rich debate and discussion concerning the concept of diglossia in the field of sociolinguistics. Ferguson is often seen as the sociolinguist that initiated significant scholarly discussion regarding the concept. As Watt states, although the term diglossia long predated Ferguson, his groundbreaking article by the same name became its defining moment. In Ferguson's 1959 groundbreaking work, he identified high and low forms of 4 modern languages: Swiss German, Arabic, Haitian Creole, and modern Greek. The high form was utilized in formal occasions and the low form in less formal situations. Romaine's introductory sociolinguistics textbook is an example of the popularization of Ferguson's categories of high and low forms of language. In particular, Romaine draws on Ferguson's treatment of modern Arabic in its high and low forms as an illustration of this idea of diglossia. As Romaine describes in her summary of Ferguson's seminal categories, the low form of Arabic spoken in the home is a form of localized Arabic, while the high form of Arabic is the variety reserved for more formal social contexts. The high form of Arabic takes many of its normative rules from the classical Arabic of the Quran. Romaine summarizes Ferguson's distinction between high and low Arabic in its Egyptian context in this way, quote, "The standard or high language is used for high functions, such as giving a lecture, or a reading, or writing, or broadcasting, while the home variety is reserved for low functions, such as interacting with friends at home," unquote. After summarizing Ferguson's analysis of the high and low forms of modern Arabic, Romaine goes on to describe how the high and low forms of Arabic are acquired. The process is relatively simple. The low form is typically acquired in the home as the mother tongue and continues to be used throughout life. In family contexts or around friends and close acquaintances, the low form of Arabic continues to be used. The high form of Arabic, however, is learned through schooling and never, or at least infrequently, at home. Romain goes on to describe in broader terms the kind of societal compartmentalization that often happens in diglossic societies, sometimes resulting in restricted access into social context based on the high-low distinction. In some diglossic societies, entry to formal institutions such as school, government, requires knowledge of the high form of the language. Profoundly important here is the sociological reality that in many diglossic contexts, the high form of the language is seen to be what Romain describes as the real form of the language, and that the low form is substandard. Even more important here is the reality that when one breaks the rules of when to use the high or when to use the low form of language, ridicule often follows. As Romain states, an outsider who learns to speak the low form of a language and then uses it in formal speech will be ridiculed. Watt, echoing once again the seminal work of Ferguson, describes other modern examples of diglossia in the Western Hemisphere. He goes through and identifies a few others. I'm going to skip over some of those for the sake of time. Moving over to a next part of my paper titled Education in the First Century, the Greco-Roman system and the Jewish system. In our discussion of the phenomenon of diglossia and high and low forms of a given language, we briefly discussed how one's formal education or lack of it plays a significant sociological role. As we seek to understand how this phenomenon translates to the thought world of the New Testament, it would be helpful for us to survey the formal educational options available to individuals in the first century. Porter, in his book, The Apostle Paul, His Thought, Life, and Letters, presents a helpful and well-documented description of the two main systems of education available to individuals, particularly in the Eastern Roman Empire of the first century. One system was the Greco-Roman educational system, and the other was the Jewish educational system. First, a survey of the Greco-Roman educational system of the first century is in order. The Greco-Roman world of the period was diverse, both in terms of vast geographic spread, but also in terms of diverse subcultures represented. The many vassal subcultures that made up Greco-Roman society were held together by the overarching Hellenistic cultural structures that served as a kind of imperial glue. Because of the pervasiveness of that Hellenistic glue, the Greco-Roman educational system, by and large, across geographic and cultural spread, was remarkably consistent, so Porter argues, so that it can be described with some degree of certainty. As surveyed by Porter, the Greco-Roman educational system probably consisted of two tracks organized on social lines. The first educational track was for the lower class, which included the slave class. The first track was limited to elementary education, including how to read, to write, and to do basic mathematics. This was typically the limit of formal education encountered by the lower class. The second educational track, again as explained and surveyed by Porter, was for those of status or of the upper class. Typically, formal education for those of privilege had two distinct stages. The first stage, which was often delivered in the home school context, involved the student learning to read and write, and then moving on to reading and memorizing the major classical artists, especially Homer and Euripides. Students at this first stage would also learn how to compose essays and letters, besides studying other subjects such as geometry and music. The second stage of formal education for the upper class took place outside of the home in the gymnasium, under the guidance of philosopher teachers for the purpose of becoming a good citizen. In another essay titled Paul and His Bible, His Education and Access to the Scriptures of Israel, Porter further explains the content of the Greco-Roman curriculum during its two stages. I'm going to skip over that a little bit for the sake of time, and just make a couple of comments about the Jewish educational system in the first century. A survey of the Jewish educational system in the first century is also in order. There has been much written on the topic of the Jewish educational system in the first century, much of which has focused on the education of Paul. Again, Porter surveys the significant literature on the education of Paul. In particular, how much exposure did Paul have to the Greco-Roman educational system given his association with Tarsus, and whether or not his primary influence was more related to the Jewish educational system given in his association with Gamaliel. The scholarly discussion on these questions is far from certain. The Jewish educational system in the first century, as Porter summarizes, consisted of a two-stage system like the Greco-Roman system. Porter states that it's possible that the prescribed system of Jewish education took its formative influence from the Greek system. This would make sense, since Jewish communities both in Palestine and in the diaspora were under the larger umbrella of the Greco-Roman culture. In the first stage of Jewish educational system, Jewish boys were taught to read and write, with the central focus of their studies being the scriptures. After the young man's bar mitzvah, those with academic promise were sent on to stage 2 to study under more advanced teachers in Jerusalem. The Apostle Paul then becomes an example of this two-stage system. In Porter's reconstruction, quote, Paul was born in Tarsus, received his grammatical education there, before moving to Jerusalem, possibly around the age of 13 to 15, to receive his rabbinical education under Gamaliel, unquote. What one can observe from the two-stage system of Jewish education in the first century is, once again, that this system serves as a context in which diglossia is likely to emerge. In the Jewish context, the vast majority of Jewish men were schooled in basic reading and writing and the study of the Hebrew scriptures in the local setting of the synagogue. But then the second, more exclusive stage involved a centralized educational system in Jerusalem with a more sophisticated academic setting, limited to those with academic promise. This bifurcation between the two stages of education is most likely highlighted in the Sanhedrin's confrontation of Peter and John, recorded for us in Acts 4:13. In this episode, when Peter and John were brought before the Sanhedrin in response to the two disciples proclaiming the name of Jesus in the temple complex, and after Peter's speech before them, members of the Sanhedrin are astonished and describe the two men as, quote, unschooled men, unquote. The term unschooled, that's the translation the ESV uses, likely should not be understood to mean that they were illiterate. Rather, that Peter and John had only experienced the first stage of a Jewish education, the localized first stage. They had not moved on to the second stage of more advanced education in Jerusalem. Jobes argues for this understanding of the Greek that stands behind unschooled men in a lengthy excursus on the Petrine authorship of 1 Peter in her commentary on that book. Moving to some final thoughts here and making an application to New Testament studies, particularly looking at 1 Peter. While there is virtual unanimity in the early church that the Apostle Peter was the author of 1 Peter due to the letter's self-attestation in verse 1 of chapter 1, more recent scholarship has been much more skeptical about Petrine authorship. Michael states the issue well. Quote, it's been frequently suggested that the elegant Greek of 1 Peter does not appear to be the work of a Galilean fisherman whose native tongue was certainly Aramaic. Unquote. Keener likewise states regarding the style of 1 Peter that there are, quote, signs of stronger skill in Greek composition than what we would expect in a Galilean fisherman. Quote. Jobes echoes this sentiment when she writes in her commentary, quote, the Greek of 1 Peter does not seem to be too good for Peter to have written it. It is at this point that Jobes offers a caution. While there is enough evidence to indicate that the Greek of 1 Peter has a certain elegance of style that one would not expect from a Galilean fisherman, long sentences and rhetorical elements, the elegance of the letter should not be overstated. After all, how does one assess elegance in language? One way to determine elegance on the part of 1 Peter is to assess the degree to which Aramaic finds its way into 1 Peter in the form of Semitic interference. I'll talk a little bit about Semitic interference. I'm going to actually, for the sake of time, skip down just a little bit further. Let's see. Where's a good place to pick up? Okay, let's go here. Traditionalist interpreters who want to maintain Petrine authorship of 1 Peter have proposed various solutions to these questions. Keener, surveying the work of Johnson, mentions the view held by some that Peter possibly underwent something like a rhetorical training while leading the Jerusalem church, which gave him the ability to produce a letter like 1 Peter. This view is ultimately dismissed by Keener as something that's very difficult to substantiate. Other traditionalists appeal to the growing evidence for more sophisticated bilingualism in the Lower Galilee of the first century than has been previously thought. Michaels suggests the possibility that the Apostle Peter used a scribe or amanuensis in the production of his letter, a suggestion that is not unique to Michaels. Keener suggests that perhaps Silvanus or Mark, both mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 5, served as Peter's scribe. Keener goes on to observe that if Mark is the John Mark of Acts, he grew up in a household of means, which would have provided Peter, in the person of Mark, with a capable amanuensis for the production of 1 Peter. A scribe in the employ of Peter might be the reason why the letter is impressive from a stylistic perspective, but yet still retains an air of apostolic authority. Michaels mentions this theory in passing without moving on to explore any underlying motivation for why Peter might employ a scribe in the writing of this letter. Why would Peter, who in his multilingual context, knowing both Aramaic and Greek, employ a scribe in the production of this letter? Why would he not simply be satisfied with using his rudimentary Greek in the writing of his letter? This is where sociolinguistics, particularly the thoughts surrounding the relationship between diglossia and social context, might provide a rationale for this altogether likely resolution to the authorship dilemma. And so, in concluding, again for the sake of time, what I propose in the remainder of the paper is that based on this notion of diglossia, high and low levels, high and low types of language, Peter actually relied on the expectation of the original readers, who would have expected an apostolic letter to come with some degree of sophistication. After all, it's a kind of a formal piece of communication. And so rather than writing in the kind of Yinzer language of his day, he employs an amanuensis to assist in writing a letter with a little bit more Greek flair. And that's where the paper ends.